Arkham Origins is probably the worst Arkham game by every measure, and now I'll tell you that it's good and you should play it. Until the end of this video, when I'm going to repeat that first sentence, and hopefully that will make it seem like this has a structure. Warner Bros. Montreal was tasked with creating a comparable successor to Rocksteady's Arkham games, with a quarter of the development time and a team whose experience consisted of porting Arkham City to the Wii. Now, game publishers don't like to publish their budgets because people would realize that they spend more on marketing than they do on making games, but this game has tight budget written all over it. But beyond that one massive limitation, I think it is the best Arkham game because it has such deliberate creative direction. In my mind, this is a more than worthy addition to the canon of technically inferior but creatively superior outsourced franchise video game sequels. Now, the Arkham series has forever ruined game criticism because they made you
feel like Batman,
which is actually a less annoying way for game critics to say that they had minimal ludonarrative dissonance. You know, it's hard to do something that Batman wouldn't do. You can, like, fall off things and die. In Arkham Knight, you can murder people with your car. But other than that, it's pretty consistent. Do they make you feel like Batman? No, not really. They make you feel like you're controlling the character of Batman, largely because that is what you're doing. That's why it feels like that. But if you were to look at all the additions that Origins made to City, you can see that it's all in service of bridging that gap in player-character alignment. And sadly, that list is actually so small that's an activity that you could realistically do. So the Rocksteady games are the worst nights of Batman's life, and this is like a night. The other games place Batman as stuck in a situation and trying to get out, which is kind of a neat, dramatic hook. The only problem is that I'm not stuck in that situation as a player, which might seem like a weird nitpick, but bear with me. The premise here is that there's 8 assassins after Batman, and he wants to head out and fight them all, which as a player, that's what I want to do. Obviously there's twists and turns to that, and the core narrative thrust of the game is actually a mystery plot, but just in the premise it means that it's not immersion breaking to walk away from computer. There's no false urgency. In Arkham City, Batman's poisoned and he urgently needs to find the antidote, but you can go and put in 40 hours of side questing and exploration first, which gameplay-wise is actually encouraged. Arkham Knight realizes this and does this weird thing where at the end of each main mission, Alfred calls you to give you the narrative hook to continue, and then goes, but please check out the side quests, and you go, well, okay, but what about this narrative hook? Origins leaves it up to the player. There's only a couple of pieces of enforced narrative urgency, packed right up at the end of the story. Of course, as soon as you arrive anywhere, it turns out that there's a hostage situation and you urgently need to intervene, but it doesn't bait you with that upfront. I didn't realize this was what this was. I'm not really interested in doing a boss fight right now. I might just leave you. Oh, fuck. And there aren't multiple things going on here or multiple tones coming together. It's a pretty cohesive world. Everything leads back to this single mystery plot, which makes the design feel so much more deliberate in the narrative and the gameplay. And even in the look, they've stripped away all the heavy post-processing of the other games, which does make the world look worse, but it means that once they get into an actual set piece, they can push the lighting so much further into an actual designed look that can feed into the narrative. And narratively, the origin part of Origins isn't about parents in alleyways or training in a temple. It's about the formation of relationships and challenging the idea of Batman, which, just as a premise, makes for fertile ground for the player to insert themselves into Batman, figuratively. So the gameplay is worse. I believe they had to partially rebuild the combat system, and it's just slightly clunkier than the other games in every way. Well, close enough. But I think this game does a much better job of immersing you in its gameplay. There's a much more deliberate attempt to teach you all of the gameplay elements without tutorials or anything. For the most part, the Rocksteady games kind of just throw everything at you, and it works because the gameplay is so sleek. You know, you can master it, or you can just mash buttons and get through the whole game. I played Arkham Knight recently, and once I was done, I messed around in the challenge maps for a bit, and it's insane how deep the combat systems are. There was so much that I wasn't even aware of playing the base game. But Arkham Origins really wants you to discover all that by the end of the story. There's more variants in enemies, they're introduced so gradually, it's ridiculous, and the overhauled XP and Dark Knight systems really encourage you to learn those mechanics. This game is often praised as having the best boss fights, which is interesting because almost all of them are borrowed from Arkham City. Most of them take a piece of the Ra's al Ghul fight. And that's interesting because the Ra's al Ghul fight isn't particularly celebrated, but like the Deathstroke one here is. In Origins, all the bosses are based around a single mechanic, whether it's quick gadgets, countering, free flow, and I think it's down to that singular focus. In City, if you lost that Ra's al Ghul fight, it's probably because it threw some bullshit at you that you weren't expecting. But the Deathstroke one here is just about countering, so if you fail it, it's because you failed to counter. And once you succeed, you've mastered the art of countering. And the idea is that by the end of the game, the bosses have forced you to master all of the gameplay elements. And if you've been playing along at home, what that means is it makes you, the player, as good at being Batman as the character of Batman. So just in the design choices, not by adding anything, they've enforced that player-character overlap. And just as a little detour, you can see their mastery of this in the crime scene investigations, which are very simple and linear. You go somewhere, you click a couple things, Batman does a narration. But what they do so well is keep them to short little moments and hide the information from you so that you come to the exact same realizations at the same time as Batman.
What kind of monster forces a man to kill the ones he loves?
The Joker, baby.
The Joker.
Maybe it's annoying to say this, but Batman has a bit of a Batman problem. He's not fundamentally a relatable character. He's usually a orphaned billionaire on a deranged militant fascist crusade, which for normal people isn't relatable because you're normal. Which is why it's so popular to treat Batman as a noir anti-hero. In a noir, your protagonist doesn't need to be good, just required by the plot. And that's why modern Batman always focuses on the villains, with Batman just also there. But Origins takes a slightly different approach. It's still firmly in the noir anti-hero camp, but he's not a necessity due to uppity Italians. He's a necessity due to the failures of the elite and the corruption of the police. You spend a good third of this game punching out cops, obviously with a view towards completely CTE-based police abolition. But it does actually care about the problems with the character and questions them throughout the game. So as far as Batman goes, it's a pretty nuanced take. It's self-critical, he's not sure it's a good idea, Alfred's not too keen, Gordon's not on board, and he only beats up one caricature of a revolutionary.
Now, back to your regularly scheduled programming of propaganda and consumerist garbage.
Don't get me wrong, it doesn't actually have anything of value to say, but it does at least pose the questions. And just by confronting that aspect of the world, it makes for a more relatable Batman, where the unemotional torture and complete control that Batman has in the other games makes for a jarring dissonance between the normal player who is normal and whiffs a free flow or gets seen in combat. Origins presents a younger, rougher, less fascist Batman who fails, isn't perfect, and knows it, which makes for a much more natural player insert. And it's not just Batman, everyone gets a more sympathetic read in this game. All the characters have a defined inner life. It cares about its world and its characters, and it has consistent thematics. After a very muddled plot, Arkham Knight leaves you with a message that Batman wasn't brutal enough, and he should have been using fear gas against robbers. Where Arkham Origins is built around interrogating the idea of Batman and the building of his relationships. So at the end we get a speech about hope and belief as catalyst for change, which is maybe trite, and in this universe ultimately still does lead to him torturing people with a car, but at least in this game, they were going for something. So out of all the Arkham games, Origins feels like the one that really nailed its narrative, made the smartest design choices with what they had, and had the most cohesive vision. But obviously it's all hampered by the lack of polish. Rocksteady's games are so polished, and this is rough, which obviously just comes down to money. Clearly what happened here is that Warner Brothers wanted a filler game, and they didn't want to pay for the old guard, so they brought in some fresh talent, and the fresh talent brought new and interesting ideas and choices. Eric Holmes is the creative director of this game. And if you look at his portfolio, you can see his fingerprints all over this. So definitely keep an eye on him. And I hope we'll see a shift as game engines become more and more accessible. But right now, the only way that a game of this scale is getting made is with funding from a big publisher. And there are always going to be fuckers with their budget. There's no amount of smart consumer decisions that's going to change that. If you haven't played an Arkham before, I think this is a pretty good place to start. You know, Asylum's getting on a bit, unless you want to play the remaster that looks worse. And the only problem with this is that it's bad, but I think it's good and you should play it.